Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the Washington Policy Pulse with Nathan Dean here in Washington. Joining me is Elliot Stein up in New York City. He is BI Senior Litigation Analyst. I asked him to come on to talk about something in just a few minutes, but let's get some housekeeping out of the way. Just really quiet week here in Washington. I actually ran into a congressional staffer over the weekend and said, "What's going on?" He said, "I got 6 weeks of vacation." So if that gives you any idea of what Congress is doing at the moment, they're all out in their districts running for reelection or for election and so forth. But a couple of things I want to highlight. First off, our colleague Holly Frome was writing about the potential strike that will take place tonight at midnight for longshoremen over at the East Coast ports. This is important because President Biden does have the ability to come in and stop the strike if he so chooses. And Holly's piece that she put out just this morning suggests that President Biden isn't going to do that. It's certainly not want to come in and stop a union strike during an election time, but you could see economic pain continue to grow over the next few weeks. So there will come a point where what's more important to President Biden, the election, the union support, or the economic support. So stay tuned. And if you do have questions on that, Holly Fromm is our analyst who's looking at that. Second thing I want to talk about is tomorrow night is the vice presidential debate between Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. It's going to be tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Eastern in New York City on Fox News. And I want to take this minute just to share my screen. And I'm going to show you some of the research that we've been putting out on both the presidency, sorry, the vice presidencies. So let me go ahead and get the appropriate screen. I don't want to share all of that, so let me see. Okay. Okay, so you should be seeing JD Vance. Okay, let's just go ahead and go with that. You should be seeing my screen right now that talks about the Vance presidency. So when it comes to the J.D. Vance presidency and it comes to the vice presidential debate, we should just say that, look, it is a vice presidential debate. It's certainly fun to watch. It's certainly great for headlines, but vice presidents tend to not really have much in the way in conducting policy unless the president delegates that policy to them. So think of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was able to get a lot of policy because George W. Bush deferred that to Vice President Cheney, and a lot of our U.S. defense strategy and so forth was implicated or impacted or led by Vice President Cheney. So when it comes to a Vance presidency, what we should note is that we've got a couple of sectors. Now, J.D. Vance is an economic populist. Some of you have heard me say this before, and I'll say it again, is he actually came to the Bloomberg office about 6 months ago, and he spoke over in the conference room over there, and he called Lena Khan, the Federal Trade Commission chairwoman for President Biden, the best thing that President Biden has ever done, and even insinuated that President Trump should keep her on. Now, begs the question, why is J.D. Vance praising, Lena Khan when she's gotten a lot of criticisms from other members of the Republican Party? Well, J.D. Vance comes from this idea of economic populism. And so, he's done a lot of work with Senator Elizabeth Warren, for example, and he's actually got quite friendly relations with Senator Warren, and they work on a lot of things. So it's this idea of, economic populism, and it's really been targeted at things like crypto, big tech, and so forth like that. So, big crypto, big crypto. Crypto, for example, could influence the ongoing debate. He has, at least in 2022, disclosed that he had at least $100,000 worth of Bitcoin. He's been working on a lot of legislation that's supposedly be more crypto friendly than what the House originally had put out in terms of the FIT, the Financial Innovation and Technology Act. Look, I don't think that legislation is going to go anywhere, and I don't even think it's going to go where if he wins next year. But if President Trump delegates that authority to him, you certainly could see a push for more crypto-friendly regulations, even more so than what the House is giving right now. In terms of banks, well, Senator Vance has been, called for the Basel III endgame to be scrapped, something that we think that President Trump would also call for. But he's also called for clawback of legislations from bonuses and so forth like that. Not something that you see from the, stereotypical Republican equals good for big business type of wing. Other things, merchants, he's been very friendly in terms of merchant fees. He's supported Senator Dick Durbin's Credit Card Competition Act. This is the bill where it would actually make it more competitive for credit cards and therefore could lower fees that the retailers pay the banks, for example. But then he's also a wild card for things like pharma, health share, and then finally this idea of big tech liability shield, because Senator Vance at the heart is somewhat skeptical of big business, big industry, and so forth. And if this idea of economic populism goes into the White House, you certainly have a lot of questions of how President Trump would operate if he was president. Now, talking about the Tim Walz presidency. So the Tim Walz presidency, a lot of it is little change to what you're currently getting from the Kamala Harris side. We think it dovetails quite with Vice President Harris on things like finance, energy, antitrust, financial regulation, little changed, carbon goals, little changed, likely on board with Harris's pro-EV push. The only really thing that we could see that would potentially be a little bit different than where Kamala Harris is potentially on things like marijuana. Governor Walz supported marijuana deregulation, has actually supported a lot of pro-marijuana initiatives while governor. And that could change a little bit depending, but again, this really depends if and when the president or the vice president Harris were to delegate that authority. So certainly something to keep in mind as we watch that debate. So with that out of the way, the next thing I want to talk about is why I brought Elliot on board. Is because things are happening quietly with Congress, and we don't even see a lot of regulatory movements happening at the moment. Just keep in mind that we are waiting for the Fed to finish its regional bank long-term debt rules. We've heard that could come as soon as October. But I wanted to bring Elliot on a little bit more to talk about Wells Fargo and TD Bank in particular, because Wells Fargo is currently under a Fed asset cap. Going back all the way to 2018, there is this asset cap that won't allow Wells Fargo to organically grow. And then secondly, TD Bank has had a lot of AML issues, and I know there's a lot of trader angst or investor angst over what ultimately the impact could be for TD Bank. So Elliot, let's start with Wells Fargo. Bloomberg News reported over last week that Wells Fargo had created a third-party report of its systems, of its processes, and its risk management procedures, and that third-party report was going to be sent to the Fed for the Fed to sign off and say, hey, yeah, you're doing your job. Do you think the asset cap is going to be lifted anytime soon?
Hey, Nathan. Thanks for having me on. I think if you are looking at this and you're waiting for this asset cap to be lifted, you should be cautiously optimistic about the news last week. That third-party review was required by the consent order, and submitting the third-party review to the Fed and getting the Fed to sign off on it is also part of the consent order before the asset cap can be lifted. What I think gives me a little pause is, I've been tracking the various consent orders that Wells Fargo has been subject to over the years, and it's, I describe it as sort of Sisyphean in that, like, they have a whole slew of these consent orders, and it feels like every time they get one lifted, maybe another one gets imposed on them for something different. So they have made some progress on some of these consent orders, including ones that were imposed in 2016 following the fake account scandal, and they've had a few more, and those have been lifted now. But since 2016, more specifically in like 2018 and 2020, they had a couple other consent orders imposed on them, which still remain, and those have to do with other retail products, including like car insurance and mortgage issues and deposit accounts. And these are CFPB and OCC consent orders that still remain. And then just earlier in September, the OCC imposed another consent order having to do with Wells Fargo's anti-money laundering and sanctions controls, right? Actually, that wasn't a consent order; it was an agreement. But still, it requires Wells Fargo to take steps to remediate its issues. So all in all, that's what gives me pause, that there are still these lingering issues that may concern the Fed. So we'll see, how the Fed looks at this third-party review. It is a good step. It's progress. I would just be cautiously optimistic if you're expecting the asset cap to be lifted, early in 2025. I think that's definitely the earliest it's going to happen. I don't think anyone expects it to happen before then. But I think there's a good possibility that the Fed has additional questions that maybe delays lifting the cap, perhaps even to 2026.
That sounds good. And one of the reasons why I think there's usually optimism at the beginning of the year is because for those of you who are in the banking space, you probably know this, that the supervisory letters get sent to banks and their camel ratings are assigned at the first part of the year by regulators. And oftentimes we'll see in that letter, hey, you know, you've done a great work. We're actually beginning to feel a little bit better about here's the plan, so forth. So you generally see more optimism towards the beginning of the year, and as the year goes on, things change. So, okay, so great on that. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in Toronto, and one of the big questions I got was, what is going on with TD Bank? And in fact, I think markets were even moving on some of these remarks about just what's happening here. So the Wall Street Journal put out an article last week. What was that article about, and how does that fit with your analysis of TD Bank?
Yeah, that article came out Friday night while I was hanging out with friends, watching football. Um, so a nice, news drop to ring in the weekend. So my take, yeah, I mean, everyone's familiar with TD's issues. Again, this also has to do with money laundering that, TD Bank accounts were being used by drug smugglers to launder money, among other things. TD has reserved, taken $3 billion in provisions for anticipated penalties. They've also said that they expect non-monetary penalties, and we can talk about that in a second. Actually, it sort of dovetails with Wells Fargo's issues. But the news Friday night was interesting because two points that I think were interesting. One is that it sounds like they're extremely close to settling this, and the Wall Street Journal suggested it may happen in the next 2 weeks. And as part of that settlement with U.S. authorities, the article said that TD Bank would plead guilty as well. And so what does that mean? I think it often sounds worse than the ramifications actually are. There are two collateral consequences to pleading guilty usually for banks. One is that they can no longer manage 401k or pension assets without getting a waiver from the Department of Labor. And the second consequence is that they lose their well-known seasoned issuer status, which that status makes it easier to issue securities, and without it, there are just more hoops you have to jump through if you don't get a waiver from the SEC. But having said that, both the Department of Labor and the SEC almost invariably grant these waivers, but there have been instances where they don't. For example, the Department of Labor rejected waivers recently for BNP Paribas and also RBS, I believe, and the SEC also similarly rejected a waiver petition recently as well. So, we'll see where that goes. But that's the most likely consequence. The other thing that I'm watching with TD Bank is, they've taken $3 billion in provisions. We don't know exactly what the final settlement amount is going to be. They may still have to take more. And based on a comparable from about 10 years ago involving HSBC, they took provisions twice, and then when they finally settled, they took an additional provision. And based on sort of how that progressed, I think it's possible that TD Bank may still have to take additional provisions up to $1 billion if the settlement winds up being closer to $4 billion than the $3 billion that they've provisioned for. And then the other thing I'm looking at with respect to TD, and this again dovetails with Wells, is that TD has said that they expect also monetary penalties by regulators, meaning something besides a fine. And, with Wells Fargo, that took the form of an asset cap. I don't, it's theoretically possible with TD Bank. I think it's unlikely. I'm leaning towards the unlikely side of things on that, just because, Wells was distinguishable because they had a whole slew of retail issues in particular, which is why they have all these consent orders. TD Bank doesn't really have that. They did have an AML fine from 2013, so that gives me a little concern, but it's not in the same ballpark as well. I think more likely they'll have some sort of restriction on acquisitions without regulatory approval first. And, that's sort of why their acquisition of First Horizon fell through a couple years ago. And it's also something we've seen the OCC do with Citibank more recently. So I think that's probably the most likely non-monetary penalty. So that's what I'm looking at with TD Bank.
Sounds good. So the last 2 minutes of what I want to do is I just want to share my screen one more time and show you where the current polling data for the election is falling. So the first thing I want to show you is this is, if you can see my screen right here, this is the Polymarket state level prediction markets. This shows you that if the predicted markets and the Polymarket prediction markets were to come true, Vice President Harris would win 276 to 262. Again, this is the betting markets. I always remind people that Beyonce was in a 99% chance of appearing at the DNC convention until she didn't, but certainly interesting data to play with. And then the other thing I want to show is the real market polling data. This one is a little bit different. This one actually shows President Trump winning 283 because this one has President Trump winning Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, and Arizona. So it's almost a clean sweep for all the states that matter. Now, who's going to win, who's not going to want? We can't honestly tell you. The data, we can show you data that shows both scenarios, but then again shows you how quickly and how close this race is going to be. So with that, I'm going to stop there. I apologize for running over a little bit. Thank you very much for your time. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And again, wish you a great week and take care. Thank you.